Welcome to another climate conversation, our series of cross-disciplinary conversations between researchers affiliated with the Guelph Institute of Environmental Research at the University of Guelph. I'm Catherine Bush, novelist, associate professor of creative writing in the School of English and Theater Studies, and the faculty team leader of Imagining Climates, which is a research project at the Guelph Institute of Environmental Research. I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 57 territory in Eastern Ontario, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe people. The Guelph Institute of Environmental Research acknowledges the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe peoples on whose traditional territory GEAR works. And I'm joined today by Amanda Boetzkes and Karine Gagné. Amanda is professor of contemporary art history and theory at the University of Guelph. Her research focuses on the intersection of artistic practices with the life sciences and global systems of energy use. She's the author of Plastic Capitalism, Contemporary Art and the Drive to Waste, MIT Press 2019, and The Ethics of Earth Art, University of Minnesota Press 2010. Karine Gagné is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Guelph. She's the author of Caring for Glaciers, Land, Animals, and Humanities in the Himalayas, 2019. Her research, based primarily in the regions of Ladakh and Zanskar in the Indian Himalayas, examines the political and cultural dimensions of human interactions with the environment. Amanda and Karine, welcome. Your research similarly and differently exists at intersections of culture and the natural world, and has also addressed the complex ontologies of ice, particularly glacial ice. Amanda at the borders of the Greenland ice sheet, Karine in the Himalayas. I'd like to use a quote from this weekend's The Guardian from Peter Soutouris, author of Educating for the Anthropocene, to provide an overarching framework for this climate conversation. This being the climate crisis, he says, is a crisis of culture and politics, not of science and technology. To believe that we can innovate and engineer ourselves out of this mess is to miss the key lesson of the Anthropocene, that dealing with planetary scale processes calls for humility, not arrogance. I'm interested that both of you see ice as a crucial site for exploring what Amanda has called the global climate change imaginary. I'm intrigued, Amanda, by your idea that we need to de-dramatize the issue of the climate crisis, even if this is the most urgent of conditions. That's your language. I'm similarly intrigued by Karine's idea of vital ice. Ice, again, as more than physical matter, but ice as potential sentient being, mirror of humanity, a body, a site of complex culture that has its own or their own effective storylines. Again, that language is yours. Amanda begins from a place of engagement in art history while also embracing encounters with the material and natural world, including with waste and plastics, a compacted form of the energy released by oil. And Karine, you engage with cultures as an anthropologist engaged in multi-species anthropology, a term that I hope that you can unpack for us. So Amanda, to start with you, can you perhaps give us a bit of an overview of your prior research leading up to what brought you to the edge of the Ilulissat Glacier in Greenland on the moraine, the terminal moraine there?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with talking about the contemporary art world a little bit, and just to say, since I am an art historian, that the intersection between the art world and the kind of scientific imaginary of climate change has been taking place now for several decades, but very acutely in the last, say, 5 to 10 years. And along with that trajectory has been a kind of foregrounding of indigenous epistemologies, and artistic practices, and in terms of climate change, Inuit epistemology and art. I began researching the circumpolar north in part because I was very struck. I was writing my book Plastic Capitalism, and sort of right at the end of that time, I heard that the Canadian Inuit artist Annie Putugu had died, and in part, so she was a contemporary artist who was in many ways sort of boosted into global recognition for her work, and especially for her realist representations of life in Nunavut. And it struck me that there was a major gap in between sort of the kind of world that she was representing, one that was deeply affected by the traumatic dimensions of colonization, climate change, and changes to livelihood and lifestyle, and of course, the impoverishment of Nunavut, and then this contemporary art world where her, her art was being celebrated as representative of Inuit life. And it struck me that that gap there was also a failure to think about the relevance of what she was representing as part of a global picture of climate change. And so I wanted to start researching climate change in ways that integrated Inuit perspective, but in ways that would teach me as well. It wasn't that I'm new to thinking through with the kind of specificity for Inuit livelihood and the relationship to something like melting glacier ice. So I began researching the circumpolar north more broadly, but also became very interested in Greenland, and partly because the Greenland ice sheet itself is a kind of entity that's being measured by scientists and specifically glaciologists. So this is where we get a gauge and dates and rates of glacier ice melt. But I wanted to think about that from a particular perspective, and one that was informed by the politics of sovereignty in Greenland. So Greenland is a sovereign nation, but one that is economically still tied to the Danish realm. And I wanted to think about the Greenland ice sheet as Inuit land per se, but also as a kind of geological actant. So a way that everybody is affected by the melting ice sheet. So I came to think, that the best way to approach the research was to draw from a number of experts, but also to think together. To me, it was very important that the research be site-specific, and that it not be dissociated from either the ice sheet or the land itself, and that the politics of land and sovereignty be an integrated facet of thinking through climate change on a global scale. So I held a workshop called At the Moraine, envisioning the concerns of ice. And so it was a pretty small workshop, but one of the highlights of the workshop was a performance by the Greenlandic artist Jessie Kleeman. And But we also had a glaciologist there, somebody who had been studying the Greenland ice sheet for his whole career, but had never been to Greenland. So he was somebody who was working, through remote technologies, information and data from remote technologies, and doing modeling based on those technologies. So those, I think, between Jesse Kleeman and the glaciologist, these were sort of two polarities. And to be together at the ice sheet, and to try and kind of work through what these different perspectives were and how they might produce different kinds of meanings of melting glacier ice. That was the challenge. So maybe I'll just stop there for now. That's a lot, but that's my opening gambit.
That's great. Thank you. And I hope that you'll talk a little more about the moraine and, situating yourself specifically at the moraine, the edge of the glacier. But Karine, I wonder if you can tell us what drew you to the glacial regions of the Himalayas as a site for your research. What it was about the particular intersections of climate and glacial landscape and the interrelations between human and non-human cultures in the natural world that drew you to this location, this material world.
Yeah, I mean, I find a lot of resonance between like Amanda's trajectory and then how I came to glaciers in the Indian Himalayas. So I, like, before doing my PhD studies, I had work in India, like for NGOs, and then it was in the lower Himalayas, so you were not that like close to glaciers as you are as you go like further north. But then at that time, like that was like the beginning of the 2000s, it was about the time when we would hear about like popular accounts of glacier recession in the media. And what I felt was very like surprising is that it was always coming from the perspective of science. Like very, very little of these accounts were like based on local experiences, like having testimonies of local people and so on and so forth. So I thought like, well, this is interesting. And then after that, I went on to study for my PhD. And I remember I've been studying climate change from that perspective. At that time was still like something which was not that common, because I got like discouraged by some of my professor to pursue that track, saying like there's so much uncertainty. You're gonna apply for fellowship, maybe you're not gonna receive money. It's gonna be a challenge all the time. It was like very, very new in anthropology, thinking through glaciers and climate change as well. So stubbornness, I went. And then so then it was very interesting because reaching there, like being in Ladakh and starting to interact with local people about glacier and glacier recession was kind of like seeing somehow the backstage of only like what you are like presented with like in these like popular and scientific accounts. And then as you study as an anthropologist, the idea is to spend a lot of time with people, to live with them, to gain a better understanding of their worldview, like the emic perspective that we call in anthropology. And my experience in the lower Himalaya had like, I mean, I could like there were some things that I understood about like the Tibetan Buddhist culture and ways of relating to the natural world, but then being there, like in that other place, was certainly like a very rewarding learning process. And then you start to like ask people about glaciers and glacier recession, and then you start to realize that many of the explanations for glacier recessions are far from being intuitive. Like they are like pointing at historical accounts, like historical events, things related to the local politics and geopolitics, because the place where I work, Ladakh, is what we call in India this like contested border area. I mean, it's a border area because like in that area there are like these contested boundaries between India and both China and Pakistan. So it's a place which is heavily militarized, and it's a place that has seen a lot, like over the years, in terms of trauma related to the partition of India and the like multiple wars with Pakistan, and also the war with China in the 60s. So I mean, to a simple question like why are the glacier receding, then you start to hear account about like, oh, like the partition of India and the sort of violence that it brought to the region. Okay, so then what do you make of this? Like, well, what are like, so for me, it was really like putting together all the little bits of parts of that puzzle together, and then other like sort of interpretation of glacier recession were really feeding into people's relationship with the animals. It was like so present, so important in people's account, that it really like it was like a real challenge in the beginning. And I mean, like after years of like studying this and then talking to people, and it all make like clear sense to me right now, but in the beginning it's quite a challenge. So then again, like questions about glacier recession, and then answers will slowly deviate towards people having to sell their animals because there's no longer like the workforce in the household is no longer there to take care of the domesticated animals like the sheep, goats, yak. So then again, like very interesting. And then also like a reference to glacier recession were framed to relationship between people within the community that are changing, with like a changing sort of moral values, with all of the change that are brought with the militarization of the region and the sort of change in the economy. So then you realize, okay, this is very interesting. Glaciers are never just ice, right? Like they are embedded like in this whole like cosmos and universe and all these relationships. And then like how glaciers are like depicted like in this place has like the Tibetan Buddhism is certainly like a very dominant religion in this area, and also like all different like forms of like indigenous religion like bone religion. So you have all of that influence, which is sort of pointing, when you look at material produced within that framework, there's a lot of folklore that which is like referring to glaciers. And then when you put all of that together, you realize that yes, glaciers, this is not only ice that you have to sort of scrutinize and disappear, but it's like it's about reciprocity between human beings and the natural world. It's about relationship within the community. It's about your duty as a human being to care for animals, because animals have helped you to sustain this life in this very sort of difficult environment over the years. So it's all about like glaciers are not only glaciers, they are ethics, they are like this moral universe. So yes, I think I should stop here and then we can talk about this more later.
That's fascinating, Karine. Thank you. Maybe I'll just, ask you each one more question, and then I would love to hear what questions. I mean, I'm full of questions, but I would love to hear what questions you have for each other. Actually, I have sort of two prongs. When I turn back to you, Amanda, I'm so interested in this idea of de-dramatizing the issue of the climate crisis and what that means in terms of your own work and thinking. But I'm also really interested in how you ended up at the moraine. And I don't know, maybe the two are connected somehow. I mean, you've written moraine is the geological detritus left by glaciers as they recede. It is a material that ranges from vast boulders to a fine mineral-rich sand. And they mark the irreversible disappearance of glaciers. To us, they are the rough ground of a new planetary reality. So they're such a rich site. So yeah, if you can pick up on those thoughts, I would love that.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I wanted to resist when writing about climate change sort of more broadly was a kind of apocalypticism. And the kind of critique of apocalypticism is definitely a kind of important trajectory of indigenous politics, that it's sort of like it's actually a kind of subtler affectation, like, oh, it's the death of nature, it's the death of this, and actually a kind of throwing up of hands and a refusal to take responsibility for the history of colonization that produced climate change in the first place, and instead a kind of defection to like, well, the problem is so big, we can't possibly, do anything about it, a kind of paralysis. And so this, the moraine, that was a kind of insight, kind of early before the workshop, but it came from the kind of primary field research. And what I discovered was that for many Greenlanders, there's a kind of promise with glacier melt. There's the promise of hydro commodities. And then there's the moraine itself. So what I was very invested in, okay, what am I actually standing on, and how am I looking at, like, what is literally my position with regards to this massive entity, the Greenland ice sheet. And, as glacier ice recedes, it does produce this very fine, like just a silky kind of silt. And that has been researched as well. There's a Greenlandic geologist living in Denmark now called Minnik Rosing, who's been researching moraine itself as a fertilizer. And this is beginning to be used in South America and Africa as a way to enrich soil. So with desertification and global desertification, moraine itself is a kind of promise, not just a kind of economic promise for Greenlanders, but one that kind of is conceptualized in terms of global distribution and global agriculture. So there's a sense in which for what I learned from researching in Greenland is there's a kind of refusal to be apocalyptic. There's definitely a disdain for the history of colonization, and an insistence on a kind of responsibility. But for me to position the thinking of this particular time and place, and to situate it at the moraine was a kind of gesture towards this, towards resisting apocalypticism, embracing a future, but a future in which the thinking and one that embraces the aftermath of glacier recession, because it is a reality. And it's not to say that hasn't happened, but it's to say okay, but let's not stop thinking. Let's not get saturated in the excitation of, like, the media excitation about climate change and its catastrophism. Let's instead see, well, we have to continue living, and we have to continue relating. We have to coexist. And in fact, there's a sense in which thinking about moraine itself is an embrace of geotemporality. It's an awareness that there's this geological activity happening, and that changes our thinking too. So it was so moraine is a kind of figuration, but it's also one that's integrated into the materiality of the land itself. It's one that I would ideally like to work against a resource paradigm, because I think moraine is not just any kind of commodity. It's also, it could be, it can be thought that way, but it's more than that too. At the time of the workshop, I was aware of, let's acknowledge that it's the moraine that we're where we're positioned now, after a certain kind of damage has been done, and in taking responsibility for it. So a kind of, post-colonization perspective.
That's so fascinating. Karine, I see you nodding your head, and I'm thinking, as I listen to this, about your idea of vital ice and, ice bodies as a vital entity or assemblage of interdependent relations. And you've spoken a bit about that, but I wonder how you respond to, the idea of the conceptual idea of the moraine and bringing forward the idea of vitality and vital ice and the necessity of thinking that way, and bringing forward modes of storytelling, which you've also mentioned, effective storytelling about ice that moves us beyond the apocalyptic potentially.
Yes, I find a lot of resonance against here because I really like this idea, Amanda, of resisting this sort of apocalyptic like scenario for the future, because I think like it's the idea of vitalize is to point at the fact that it's more than that. Like it's just, I mean, ice like for like local communities in the Himalayas is not just this debris which is like sort of vanishing in the landscape, and then how do we analyze like how the debris, like the now becoming debris, how was it in the past, what is the trend, how it's going to be in the future. So this is sort of a very sort of like tunnel narrow vision of what like ice could be like. So vitalize, the idea is that it's not only vital like for life for the populations in the Himalayas and then lower in the plains as well, but it's also like recognizing not entirely like rejecting the materiality of the ice, but then maybe like starting from the materiality to think about what is this ice telling us like for human, like so it's about like it's again like we talked about like earlier, like this notion of multi-species anthropology. So it's well anchored in this idea of um resisting this sort of anthropocentric framework and starting from another perspective. So what do we do when we start from the perspective of ice? And maybe what is ice telling us about us human beings? And then is it really telling a story of extinction, or is there more like to the story than that sort of narrative? So yeah, so the idea of vitalize is to reflect on ice like affects like the bodies in so many different ways, more than the sort of narrative that we often think of. Amanda, in your work you're talking about this sort of climate aesthetic, and then it makes me think of how if you interact with local people in the Himalayas, when they are bringing these description of glacier and ice, it's never like flat and unidimensional, because it's like it's coming from interaction like in the landscape. So you will have references to sounds, like the sort of the noises that the glaciers are making, but also references to like stories that are sort of embedded in the various layers of the glaciers. You will have references to like different like moral stories as well, like and then different elements of a changing landscape. So I mean it's and then there's all the do's and don'ts, things that you should not do like near a glacier. So it's like it's very multidimensional. So recognizing the vitality of ice is recognizing this as well. And again, I'm sure we can talk about this because in your work, Amanda, you're referring a lot to the perspective of science, which is one framework to look at ice. And just recently, I went through these various accounts of scientists and geographers, like of the during the colonial era in India, and then how they are reporting information and how they are studying glaciers. And the very same, like very similar things are found. Like they are referring again a lot to sound, to the noise of glaciers, something which is at the current moment like rarely like evoked in scientific account, like through this sort of because glaciers from the perspective of science is very often studied from a distance. You were referring to that scientist who never like set foot in Denmark to study the ice sheet. Like in the Himalayas, like very few glaciers are studied like from proximity and interaction. It's in fact very like limited and unusual. So vitalize is about embracing all of what ice is telling you through that like proximity and physical contact, like a narrative which is really yeah, like departing from this engagement with the environment and not just like something from studied from a distance.
Amanda, I wonder, like, I give you an invitation to respond, and for the two of you to, have a back and forth at this point. I have lots more I could ask, but I'd love to, invite the two of you just to converse.
Thank you. Yeah, Karine, I've been enjoying your book very much, and thinking about the importance of, I mean, one of the things you do well, and I think we've both been quite influenced by a kind of geo-assemblage type of thinking, or, thinking not just in terms of in terms of all the interrelationships that converge through ice, but also other kinds of actants as well. And so I think I was so touched. Like, you're, first of all, you're like a wonderful storyteller and a wonderful writer. And one of the things Karine does in her book is sort of introduce the snow leopard. There's a story that she tells about the snow leopard who's been who basically raids the village that she's in, and then it becomes a quandary for the whole community. And so she talks about the snow leopard as, in some ways, like the linchpin of these interrelationships with ice and climate change, but also the deep sense of morality and responsibility for the glacier, and this is why caring for glaciers. And so it struck me that the glacier expressing itself in and through the snow leopard, and that being almost like a reversible trajectory as well, from within the community, that being super important. And it reminded me that, when one of my own frustrations with a kind of philosophical trajectory, speculative realism, is this insistence, like, climate change is something we can't see, we can't experience this phenomenologically. But in fact, no doubt in Ladakh, you can experience it phenomenologically. It happens by way of the relationship. Yeah, and this is Albie speaking of the relationships.
And snow leopards. That's the mini snow leopard.
Yeah, exactly. He came in right at that moment. So a kind of frustration with this, with this kind of master position, like, oh, we can't know, and therefore we must speculate. But in fact, the process, if we were to think about it in slightly different terms, it would happen in and through the relationships with animals, and with the ice, and with other kinds of things too. And I wonder if you might speak about the snow leopard or other kinds of relationships that you experienced, and how the access points by which you came to understand the ice as vital.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and thank you for your nice comments. I'm thinking, like, it's yeah, I'm always very fascinated about this thing, like that. Okay, so then, I mean, this rejection of, like, the sort of phenomenology of how people are knowing things and knowing the climate and everything. People in the back will talk about this all the time, like in physical material, like manifestation. Like, people will say, like, oh, but the horses are so small today. The horse have become so small because the pastures are completely, like, depleted, because, like, there is no more snow, because the glaciers are receding. But never will this be, like, sort of considered, like, legitimate for, like, as an indicator of climate change. And then it's like all of these, like, little observation, and also, like, the sort of values that people are the sort of relationship that they have with animals, but the behaviors of the animals, like, what, like, how are they behaving, is also, like, another, like embodied experience of knowing and being in the place, and how you observe changes in the environment. I mean, as much as people are commenting about climate change in the Himalayas, they will talk about, like, different behaviors that the snow leopards have, that the birds have, that the bears have, like in a place like Zanskar where I do research as well. So it's like, I mean, in one of your paper, Amanda, there is this picture of this ice with the blue water on top, and then you have this discussion of the scientists like sort of like saying that this, like, scientists are very careful when they want to talk about, like, okay, could this stand as a sign of climate change? There is like so many different parameters to bring to the pictures. But then I'm also thinking, I can't remember what documentary, but it was an Indian scientist saying, like, so we can't wait for the perfect science to tell us what is going on there, because this is never going to happen. There will be like developments and technologies and different things, so that like the perfect answer, even if we have like better technologies, and then to refer like to the article that Catherine was mentioning in the beginning, like it's not a solution. And then we need to have like different narratives and start to think of the idea of thinking about climate change and glacier recession in other frameworks, to sort of recognize that something is going on. Like, I mean, if we are still always focusing on certain elements, like these charismatic glaciers that are studied all the time, we're missing so much of the pictures. Like the picture, we're missing like all of the different struggles that farmers are going through in the summer, when they're going through drought because there is not enough snowfall, and because once you don't have enough snowfall, and if your small glacier has receded entirely, then you have nothing. But why are we not talking about this? Where is that, like, and then these things are happening for real. Like, where are they, like, in these accounts about climate change? I mean, maybe there is like, it's yeah, it's like the site of like production of knowledge should be different, and then there's other things that are legitimate when it comes to perception of the climate as well.
We're in a very difficult position, a kind of double bind, because on the one hand, what you are saying, and I would agree with you, is there's like a deep failure of science to either, I mean, like in some ways, the science doesn't anticipate, like, it's fallible, right? It's not perfect, but at the same time, we're in a moment where, you know, of like lots of political climate denialism, and so the reflex is to go to science, right? And so these are really two kind of the political polarities actually put us in a situation that is inadequate for being inadequate in terms of thinking through responsibility given climate change, given glacier melt, given colonization, and so the response that that one might want or look for, it won't come from science, even if the modeling were accurate. The responsibility doesn't sort of spontaneously emerge from the facts or the information.
I'm going to interject with one last question, as sort of a wrap-up question, if you don't mind. I'm sure we could go on and on because this is such a fascinating conversation, and I'm learning so much listening to you. But I wanted just to introduce Amanda's idea of the global climate imaginary, following on Amanda's last thoughts, and how you bring research, like the kind of phenomenological research you've both done in places that are far away from here in Southern Ontario. And so how do you bring that knowledge and those stories and the imaginaries back to, or make a relationship to our lives here in this microclimate in Southern Ontario?
I think that's a complicated question, and I think I would answer it sort of in short, just by saying, well, it's you know, it's a question of how does that knowledge come to you here, and I'm not necessarily sure. Like, I think of it in a disciplinary way. So you know, all of those what's learned from being site specific and from doing field work and from cultivating relationships and trust and doing so in a long-standing way, that's quite different than receiving all the information and all the emergency through your computer when you turn it on in the morning. What to my mind, there's a place for storytelling, for art, and for different modalities of experience that would bridge the scales and also just bridge the distance in time and space between where I am in Toronto and what I've been thinking about in Greenland. But there's also the phenomenon itself. Climate change is happening here, and I have to, now I'm wondering how can I think through what's happening here, as we were talking about earlier this morning, Catherine, like what about how am I to think about the slow warbler migration or the fact that it's a very dry spring here in relation to the outrageous melt that's been happening from the Greenland ice sheet in the last few years, and especially it was record melt last summer, and I think we can expect the same again. So the question is, how to put those together in a meaningful way, and to think through and that to me is the question of the global imaginary. But it's how do we think it through in ways that are meaningful and not just information, because I think the information can drive you into the point of paralysis or drive you into a point of, well, there's nothing I can do, or I just feel depressed, no avenue into thinking through what might be done.
Karine, do you want to respond as well?
Yeah, I find I really like this idea of it's a real challenge, as Amanda is explaining, like to how to have people like envisioning issues of climate change when maybe this is like, yeah, there is sort of a labor process, as you're explaining, Amanda. You can't just turn on the computer and it's gonna come to you. But this is why I think like ideas like the microclimate stories, or then this climate imagination that forces people to think about these things like in their everyday life. I'm in learning like over the years from people in the Himalayas, there is a part of me that feels that there is a lot of that sort of sense of responsibility which is emerging from sort of empirical like engagement and being in the environment and observing these things. But there has to be like other things, because the life that we have like in the cities, or even if it's not entirely cities, but in Canada, like there is like, because of the like there is something which is a bit disconnected often from the environment. So how do we like bring people to have this certain awareness? There's different ways, but it's very complex. But I find it fascinating as well to see that coming from different disciplinary background, like arts history and anthropology, the questions we are asking and the sort of way of envisioning the things are very, very similar. Like that we are wondering like about the different like sort of epistemologies framework, and how do we sort of contribute to these discussions that are like very, very dominated by science. I'm bringing this all the time, but I mean, I feel like I have like this sort of like I feel like things are a bit stuck. Like we need different things right now.
Well, to my mind, you're both bringing something that feels vital and essential to the, greater climate conversation, or the conversation that's happening both at Guelph and I hope moves outward from there. So thank you both so much today for taking part in this conversation.
Thank you, Catherine, for giving us the opportunity.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, Karine.